are you recording the video or just audio?
I am, well, the plan was to record audio, but I may have to record the video and then strip the audio later. If that's okay with you, I'll record.
I'm easy. I was just going to say, if you're recording video, I want to check that you're happy with what you're seeing right now.
Yeah, it looks great. I love it.
Good. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to try one more time to plug everything back in and see if I can still get your audio here. That's not what I meant to do. Okay, now do you mind saying something again?
Oh, okay. You're coming through much louder and clearer now. Yeah.
No, it didn't work. Okay, we'll just have to do it. Plug everything. You know, you get a fancy microphone and then it doesn't work with it. So that's okay.
Okay. I mean, how's it working now? Am I coming through? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great. We'll just do it all straight through the computer and forego all the fancy technology and microphones and all that kind of stuff, you know?
Okay. I have, if it's any consolation, I've met this kind of thing, even working with the BBC and, you know, other broadcasters. The machines just always have minds of their own.
That is a relief. Yeah, if it's okay for the BBC, then maybe I can get away with it. That's good to know.
But just tell me, are you going to use the audio? Because if you are, I will do my best to look at the camera. But if you're not particularly, then I might just look at the screen because I can then see you.
I think that I probably will keep the video and maybe put it up on YouTube later.
That's fine.
Let me move a few things around here. Well, thanks for making time for me on a Friday evening.
You're very welcome.
Okay, we'll get started unless you have any questions.
Nope, I'm good to go as far as I know.
All right. Well, now, look, I will say every time you've been on this show 3 or 4 times, every time that I introduce you, I read your kind of official bio, and I feel a little silly every time because I think everyone who listens to this knows exactly who you are. So in case there aren't any, I'll just say N.T. Wright is the former Bishop of Durham, and he's held many academic posts and is definitely my favorite biblical scholar. So Dr. Wright, welcome again to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, I've been an avid listener to the Ask Anything Right podcast for a long time now. And so I say that to say your friend Justin Brierley, who hosts, he calls you Tom. Now, I usually call you Dr. Wright, but if I slip and call you Tom.
No. For goodness sake, call me Tom. I'm far too old to worry about this kind of thing.
Well, that's a huge honor. Thanks. I do want to give a shout out to that podcast because I never miss an episode. It's so wonderful to hear you talk. And for those who are unfamiliar, you just take people's questions that they send in to you. It's a kind of pastoral Q&A type show that I love.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you like it. We just recorded a few more just a few days ago, Justin and I, on this same system, on a Zoom system.
Yeah, I think I caught one of I think you guys started doing just like Facebook or something like that, where more of a video.
Yeah, I just don't remember. The trouble is, at the moment, there's so many things going on, and because everything is done, or more or less everything is done on this computer, one thing blends into another. So there we are.
That is such as life during a pandemic, I found out.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So we're here to talk about your newest book, which I've got here,
Yep.
Broken
Good.
Signposts, How Christianity Makes Sense of the World. I did want to make note of another recent book that you published, God in the Pandemic.
Yeah, yeah. I have the British copy here, but the American copy looks a little different.
And so I haven't had a chance to read it. I did get to hear you discuss it.
Okay.
We're still in it, right? It's
well, yes.
Who
Absolutely.
would have thought? I remember back in March or whenever it was, thinking that this was going to be a rough 2 weeks or whatever.
I know. When I wrote this book, they called my publishers wanted to call it a Christian reflection on the coronavirus and its aftermath, because they said the whole thing may be over in 6 weeks just when the book gets published. So we've got to say something about the aftermath as well. Little thinking, as you say, that this was going on another several months, and with no end in sight now. Certainly in Britain at the moment, the rate is going up again.
Right, and yeah, same here as well. And we're kind of very worried about a second round, and especially as regular flu season is approaching us too.
Exactly.
So I know one of the things that you kind of cover in the book, and something that I think about a lot, is a very old question, which is just the problem of evil and suffering in the world. And I think that, for me, I'm much more easy to understand the kind of human suffering that is caused by others' free will. People choose to do something to oppress someone else, and I can kind of understand that and wrap my head around it. That what we call like the natural evil, when you talk about hurricanes and natural disasters and the coronavirus, that's a lot harder for me to kind of wrap my head around theologically.
Yeah, I did some work on this when I was doing my Gifford lectures a couple of years ago. I don't know if you know that book. It's called History and Eschatology, published by Baylor Press. And I got interested in this particularly because it struck me that the question of natural evil, whether it's earthquakes or pandemics or whatever, only really became seen as a problem for Christianity from the 17th and 18th century, because the Christian West had kind of shifted towards a sort of deism in which God is the celestial CEO and he's supposed to be running the show. So, well, yeah, there are bad people and they do bad things and that's too bad and whatever. But if God really was running the show, we shouldn't have things like tsunamis and volcanoes disrupting the planet and so on. And it struck me that in the Middle Ages and before that with the early Christian fathers, and certainly with the great Jewish thinkers all the way through, these things were never seen as a problem about whether you could believe in God or not. They were part of the given. And the point of God was that, yes, he's the creator, but he's involved with the world. And his plan is eventually to bring the world to a state of wholeness and completion and beauty and justice and joy. Not that he made a world without volcanoes and then volcanoes somehow snuck in, but that this world that we've got is the world that we've got, and that God is somehow involved with that. That's very threatening to many Christians, particularly in a post-deist world. Even those who reject deism itself, nevertheless still have this vision of God as the one who's pushing the buttons or pulling the levers, and somehow he seems to have gotten a bit wrong. And they said that's a very modern perception, and it goes with the idea which we in the modern West have had, that actually now that we know modern science, etc., the world is getting better and better. I mean, Steven Pinker in Harvard argued this in a couple of recent books, that actually we are moving towards utopia, and we just need to follow the Enlightenment a bit more and we'll all arrive there, and just get rid of religion and so on. And actually, this is a totally false perspective. And things like 9/11 and bank crashes and yes, pandemics call time on that facile view and remind us of what the great majority of the human race has always known, and the great majority of the human race today still does know, namely that life is messy and that if there is a God, and if he's the God of Jesus, he is with us in the mess, not sitting upstairs just waiting to press the right button. I could go on about this all night, so I better stop there.
Well, it's quite interesting. And on the point of the world getting better and better, because I've heard that a lot, and even you can measure, kind of human suffering and death and war. It seems to be, there is less and less in famine and things like that. And I think I've always thought that was part of God's kingdom drawing nearer and nearer in the world. Does that track?
Well, you know who you're siding with if you take that line. It's people like Ritschl at the end of the 19th century who looked at the 19th century in Europe and thought, well, this is the kingdom of God. The world is clearly getting better and better. We have modern democracy, we have science, we have machines, we have better medicine. Little thinking that just around the corner was going to be this funny thing called the 20th century, where that whole dream just came crashing down. And if you read, sorry to go on advertising it, but if you read the first 2 chapters of my book, History and Eschatology, I track the way in which in the modern Western world, people were led down that path. And then the First World War came along and pulled down the house on top of it all. And in a sense, some people, and Steven Pinker would be one, have been trying to get a secular version of that Ritschlian progressive kingdom of God equals world is getting better and better, but without the God bit. And again, it can't be done. Just when you think you might be within sight of it, we have a pandemic, or we have a huge bank crash, or we have a so-called Arab Spring, which leaves millions of refugees from Syria and Somalia and all over the place, quite literally washing up on the shores of Northern Europe in small, dangerous boats. If this is utopia, sorry, somebody's got the script wrong.
This brings me to another question, and our president over here famously in the last week caught COVID.
Yeah, we saw.
Yeah. You got that over there. Good. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Most people who are kind of in my orbit that I listen to and pay attention to are not huge fans of the president, but we're praying for his healing. And I really wondered, I really had to wrestle, maybe not so much with this exact situation, but, with the question of, is there ever a time where maybe praying for healing isn't the right thing for someone? It's real tricky, because I feel as though, we're always called to love our neighbor as well as our enemy. But knowing what that looks like all the time is sometimes difficult. And there are people who, perhaps we see someone who is suffering on the edge of death, and we might then pray that God would take them.
Yeah.
Could a case be made for a person who is causing suffering for a lot of other people? And again, I'm not thinking of our president. I have huge problems with our president, but I'm not ready to, compare him to Hitler and all the other great,
Yeah.
Although
it's interesting, his appearance on the Truman balcony and taking off the mask, many people have said, does remind us rather of Mussolini. The gestures and the theater of it all was straight out of the playbook of certain dictators of the past. But I mean, be that as it may, and I'm not an American. I love America. I come to America a lot. Not this year because we haven't been able to travel, but clearly I know a lot of people, including some who voted for Trump and will vote for him again, and others who would never dream of it and will certainly not be voting for him this time. So I have friends across the span, and I try to listen to what people are saying, and I understand the complexities, or some of the complexities of it all. I do think there's a case to be made for praying for every single politician for an increase in wisdom, in humility, in charity, in truth, and for the deep instinct, and for British politicians obviously as well, and European, to seek common ground and the common good, rather than to seek a polarized situation which plays off people against one another and lines up issues in this very wooden way, so that if you're on this side of the table, you have to check these boxes, and if you're on that side of the table, you have to check all those boxes. And any serious thinker knows that these boxes are actually not that easy. They don't admit of these simplistic solutions. So I think it's fair to pray. And I know somebody actually lives in Oregon, who told me that she is praying for the president's healing, but that through healing, he will learn greater wisdom and humility, because to come through a potentially fatal disease and to find that you're through the other side, with some people, that might cause an increase of humility and wisdom. And oh my goodness, I've been staring into the abyss and I've now come back, and do I want to change my mind about things? Whether that will happen, who knows? But so I think there are wise ways of praying. And I would say to anyone who's puzzled about that, pray the Psalms with that person in mind. And some of the Psalms are very angry, and you might feel angry. Okay, pray one of those angry Psalms, but then pray some of the healing Psalms as well. And as a wise friend of mine said, when there's somebody that you really can't stand, force yourself to pray the Lord's Prayer with them in the middle of it. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in this bit of earth as in heaven. Give him today, or her today, her daily bread. Forgive her her trespasses, or him his trespasses, and so on. That's really difficult to do with somebody that you either dislike or despise, but it's a spiritual exercise of being able to pray in relation to them nevertheless. I know that's difficult.
Well, I wonder, on that thought, if I could parlay to a related
Sure.
question, which is just from your view as someone from the outside looking in, but as a believer, what you make of our president and politics in general. And I'm specifically wondering what you think a pastor's role could be here in America. You know, a lot of us came from schools where we thought we should never talk politics.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I feel like really in the last 4 years, our backs have been put up against the wall where it really comes to a point. I was reminded, again, not to make comparisons to Hitler, but I was reminded the other day that Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke out against Hitler before he had committed any of the atrocities that we know of today.
Yeah. No, that's true. And again, I won't make comparisons, but there is a discernment which is vital. I think the problem is on both sides of the Atlantic, that the Enlightenment settlement, which is implicit in Europe and explicit in the American Constitution, has said, God, if there is a God, he's upstairs and you can go and visit him and be pals with him if you want, but it's got nothing to do with downstairs. And we run the downstairs world, and it evolves by democratic processes, by a sort of a biopolitical system of survival of the fittest. It is Darwinian, really, so that we have wars from time to time, but particularly we have elections from time to time, and we slug it out, and then, okay, that shakes down, and we get on, and we move forward. And so in America, by the Constitution, and in Britain by the informal Constitution, even though we have an established church, we actually still work very much mentally the same way as Americans do. It's assumed that clergy should not preach politics. But then you go back to the New Testament and you find Paul saying that Jesus is Lord in a world where the word Lord meant Caesar. And clearly there is a clash. And in John's Gospel and in this book, just to wave it for a moment, I highlight the dialogue between Jesus and Pontius Pilate in chapters 18 and 19, which is precisely the kingdom of God confronting the kingdom of Caesar on the issues of kingdom and truth and power. And then you look at today's world, whether it's Boris Johnson and Brexit, or whether it's Donald Trump versus Joe Biden or whatever, and you say, are these relevant issues for our whole society today? Truth and power, that's absolutely what it's all about, whether it's fake news or somebody seizing power or manipulating, whatever. These are the issues. And if Jesus is talking about them in John's gospel, we shouldn't be ashamed to talk about them from the pulpit and in our Bible studies and so on. The problem is we've got out of practice. In the last 200 or 300 years, the church has forgotten how to do that. And so it's like when you have a vacuum and then suddenly the vacuum bursts and air rushes in. There's something of an explosion. And what's happening at the moment, I think, is a lot of Christians are starting to wake up to the fact that the Bible is, in our language, a very political document. The formation of the church is a political act. It's a body of people owing allegiance to the God revealed in Jesus over and above any allegiances they have to their own native lands and cities and peoples and so on. That's part of the point of the church, to be that sort of cheerfully alternative community, not a gripey, subversive community like that necessarily, though there may be some occasions for that. Bonhoeffer might be one, but actually a cheerful community showing what it means to be human in a different register, to make the powers of this world realize there are different ways of doing stuff in a way that, my goodness, they need to right now.
But I'm curious what you think the place is that Christians should hold their governmental politics in their life. Meaning, 4 years ago, I was telling people that I was not going to vote at all. And I think that was, looking back at, I think that was me trying to figure out what it meant to embody having Jesus as my king and no one else. I almost instantly regretted that on election night 4 years ago. And I still struggle. And people have a real problem with voting for the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
I've kind of come to the conclusion, like, I think that's how it's almost supposed to be, meaning I don't think we should be looking for our politicians to be redemptive.
That's exactly right. And that's part of the problem long term with the 18th century Enlightenment settlement, which worked out one way in America and a different way in France. And some interesting comparisons there, because you both had revolutions around the same time and rather on similar principles. And of course, Jefferson was over in France watching what was going on and coming back and so on. A very interesting bit of history, that. But what's then happened is that both in America and in France, there's a sense that because we are now the people who made this great enlightened constitution, we ought to be having utopia. And if we haven't, it's because somehow we accidentally gave our power away to the wrong people. I mean, when America voted quite widely in favor of Barack Obama, I remember seeing a poster in a town in Texas saying, "Christian citizens of America, take our country back." And saying to a friend, "What's that about?" And he said, "Well, there is this myth that we were all somehow duped into giving our country away to almost like a foreign power, as though Barack Obama was not American." And of course, that was what Donald Trump had been trying to suggest, the whole birther controversy. But that aside, as I say, it's as though the political system has been trying to get the kingdom of God, but without God involved. Because if you want to do God, then you say your prayers and you go to heaven when you die. And that's why, of course, a great many people who have that Platonic view of salvation, namely it's a private spirituality in the present and an escape to heaven in the future, people who believe that then do regard it as a bit sort of shameful to get involved in the grubby work of politics. But then they vote for people on the grounds, as with Trump, that maybe he will enable the country to pass laws or to enact judgments which conform with some things that we think are important. Now, that's not to be sneezed at. That is quite important in itself. But actually, you're absolutely right. Politics is about the resolute pursuit of the least bad, rather than the creation of utopia and then pretending that this is really utopia, even though we know there are some shady bits to it. I heard somebody on the radio today quoting, and I forget whether it was Galbraith or one of those great economists, saying that the choice in politics is not between the absolutely right and the absolutely wrong, but between the totally disastrous and the unfortunate but livable with, or words to that effect. And I think that's much more realistic, and that's a much more sensible way of looking at it. But I mean, after all, in John 19, Pontius Pilate says to Jesus, "Don't you realize I have power to crucify you?" And Jesus says, "You could have no power over me unless it was given you from above. So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." So Jesus is saying that Pontius Pilate has a God-given authority. As Jesus, like Paul, knows that a structured state is better than anarchy. God wants the world to be run by wise human beings. So he gives Pilate this power, but he will hold him to account, and he will hold to account those who collude with him or with Caesar. So somehow we have to get our heads around stuff like that, or we have no claim to be biblical. And I fear that a lot of people in the biblical Christian bracket, which is what I grew up in, I've had to learn that the Bible has a lot of things to say which so-called biblical Christianity screened out a couple of hundred years ago and has not yet found a way of screening back in.
Well, I think we're officially talking about the book now, Broken
Yep.
Signposts.
Good. Okay.
We're talking
Yes.
about power. You know, it's so interesting when we talk about, like you were talking about Pontius Pilate and the authority being given from God. Because a lot of Christians are using Paul's words the last 4 years to say that our president was divinely given by God, and we ought to do business with those texts. It is strange to me that we kind of see, and that the signposts are broken, right? Like creation got corrupted at some point, and here we are. But yet we have politicians who are somehow divinely given to us, like they're exempt from that corruption somehow.
Yeah, now that's the trick, that in Romans 13, which is the passage which people always quote in this respect, it's very much a demotion of Caesar. And remember, Paul is writing this while Nero, the Roman emperor, is on the throne. And Paul is no fan of Rome. Some people have tried to make out, oh, well, this was Nero's early days, and it looked as if he was going to be a good and wise and careful emperor. So Paul was saying, yeah, he's good. It's not that at all. This is part of Jewish-style monotheism, that the God who made the world is the God who created humans in his image, which means God wants to rule the world through humans. That's why, look at the whole wisdom tradition. That's why he gives humans wisdom, so that they can rule his world wisely and with justice and true judgment. And if they don't, God will hold them to account. The book we call The Wisdom of Solomon, which is roughly contemporary with St. Paul, I think probably slightly older than Paul, maybe last year's BC, though we don't know that, is full of exactly this, that warning to the rulers, watch out, because you need wisdom in order to do your job. And if you don't show that wisdom, then sooner or later, God will hold you to account. And it's fascinating to me that in the ancient Roman world and Greek world, the ancient Romans and the Greeks and the Jews and the Christians who lived under their rule didn't mind so much how somebody got into power. They minded very much what that person did with power once they got it. And the task of the church, it's there in John 16, as I'm sure I discuss in the book, the task of the church is to be the Spirit's instrument in holding the world to account. When the Spirit comes, says Jesus, he will convict the world of sin and righteousness and judgment. And the Spirit's job is to enable the church to do to rulers what Jesus did to Pontius Pilate. Not to say you have no right to rule, but to say if you're going to rule, then watch out, because God is holding you to account on these charges, and here's how it works out. So, I mean, in the ancient world, there was very little democracy. If you were a citizen of Rome, you could vote, though even that was very shady and shabby, and lots of bribery and stuff went on. Most people in the world had no say in who their rulers were at all. But the Jews and the Christians knew it was their job to tell them how to do their job, even if that was a dangerous thing to do. We have reversed that, and we've got to the point where we say, as long as somebody got voted in 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, in our case, it goes up to 5 years, then they can do, in effect, what they like. If they've got a majority, oh, well, they've got a majority, so that they must do that. And so anyone who criticizes them, how can you criticize them because you voted for them? The answer is no. If they've got power, we in the church, and the Jewish community would do this as well, have the duty, not just the right, to hold up the mirror to them and say, this is what you're doing, and here's how it contrasts with what you ought to be doing as wise stewards of God's kingdom.
Well, I mean, I think that contrasts very starkly with how we do look at politics today,
Exactly.
especially us, where it's basically all dependent on one day of voting, and then it's kind of like, well, if you don't like it, let's just wait.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, there is a lot to be said for that. I'm not disapproving of democracy. I mean, I'm with Churchill on this. The Winston Churchill said, you know, democracy is the worst possible form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. And that's an important truth, that don't think that democracy will produce utopia. Democracy is the way of making sure that the thing doesn't go totally bad, and that neither the tyrants nor the anarchists can actually take over and have it their own way. And that's a dangerous moment when it tips too much in the one way or the other.
So again, we're talking about this broken signpost of power. How do Christians use, out of the realm of politics, like how do we use that power in our daily lives, that that kind of brand new power that Jesus showed on the cross?
Well, the short answer is go and read 2 Corinthians, because 2 Corinthians is all about the paradox of Christian power. And Paul says very explicitly, when I am weak, then I am strong. And unless one lives with that, you have to read through the whole letter and wrestle with what was going on there in order to get to the heart of it. Because I was doing some lectures on 2 Corinthians earlier this summer, and I think most of the audience were American. It was a Zoom series of lectures. And I said the point, rather cheekily perhaps, that Paul's opponents in 2 Corinthians were the super apostles in Corinth, who thought that Paul was a shabby, beaten up kind of creature, and we shouldn't let him even back in town because we now know how to run the church, etc., etc. So I said that Paul's point is that their slogan is, make apostleship great again. And Paul is saying, absolutely not. Make apostleship Jesus-shaped again. And power is defined in terms of the cross. And Paul sees, and he's had it etched into his own personal history, that it's the suffering of Jesus and his death on the cross, which is actually the means by which the dark powers that have tried to take over God's good creation are defeated. And Paul has discovered that it's by sharing in the fellowship of the Messiah's sufferings that he attains the position where the Spirit's power can work through him in fresh ways to convict, to heal, to bring new life. And that paradox is something that the Western Church really has not always done well with. We have sought power in order to get stuff done, and we've sought it under the world's terms. And sometimes, as with, say, St. Francis or Mother Teresa or whoever, people have actually said, no, we're going to do it the Jesus way, and look what happens as a result. And maybe this is a standing temptation, and we have to figure out in every generation how to come round the other side and do it differently. There are huge problems with that, because we get stuck in our institutional ways of doing things, both politically and ecclesially. And that's why we need reformers, visionaries, etc. But they have to be wise and know how to go about it. That's not easy.
Now, it seems like part of what you're saying is that we don't get kingdom results by non-kingdom means.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the whole Enlightenment project has been trying to get kingdom results. That's care of the poor, education, medicine, justice, etc., but without giving allegiance to God the King. And the Christian answer to that is, well, you can try if you like, and you'll get some distance down the road, but you will find it'll go horribly wrong. And even medical science, which has done such enormous, wonderful things for the benefit of the whole human race. I mean, that is truly extraordinary in the last 300 years. That can go horribly wrong, as in the medical experiments in the Nazi death camps, or indeed in some of the things that some medical researchers would like to do today, which many of us are really quite worried about.
one of the other signposts that stuck out to me was your chapter on spirituality that I really,
Okay.
it seems as though, and this was a theme throughout because I think it's a theme in the signpost, which is this idea of embodiment, of incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like on the whole, Christianity is almost the opposite or the antithesis of Gnosticism, of this detachment
Absolutely.
of our spirituality.
Absolutely. And that's a problem because Gnosticism, as I point out in the book, but it's not original to me, this comes from people like Harold Bloom and so on. Gnosticism is the default religion for a great many Americans. It's kind of built into, again, the Enlightenment project. Why is it called the Enlightenment? It's called the Enlightenment because we in the West have thrown off the shackles of former superstition, and we've now discovered the real truth, that we are it, and that we have the secret of life inside ourselves, and we don't need a God from the outside to come and rescue us or whatever. And that is simply a modern version of Gnosticism, purveyed by, I'm looking across my room here because I've got a new biography of the philosopher David Hume on my shelf. And of course, he was one of the ones who was pushing in that direction. The skepticism about the traditional religions, and then discovering that we are the people, we are the enlightened ones. So the difference being that for Judaism and Christianity, the whole meaning of God and the world has to do with now God rescuing people from a dire situation that they can't rescue themselves from. Whereas Gnosticism says, no, 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 some of us, some of you have got a secret spark inside you. And then if you foster that and recognize it, then you will discover who you really are. Guess what? I think about maybe a third of all movies in the last 100 years have been about discovering who I really am. That's one of the great legends of our time. And it's causing a lot of problems now in several different areas of life. And because sooner or later, discovering who you really are may run up against what somebody else thinks that you are or they are or whatever. There are problems there. But I think a lot of people are very inarticulate and unaware about these things. And that's why the whole question of, yes, spirituality, oh yes, that's great, I believe in spirituality, but not necessarily religion. It becomes a signpost to something, but it gets broken and it bends back and it becomes narcissistic and so on. And that's why it is a broken signpost in sore need of repair.
Well, I wonder what you think, how we how that becomes attractive to a world who really does not want to be held to account, to embody anything, like
Yeah.
like giving the idea of giving Jesus claim over what I do with my body is really an unpopular idea.
Sure, sure. And of course, if you go back to the 2nd and 3rd century when Gnosticism was on the increase, some people have tried to push that back into the 1st century, but that seems to be very historically unlikely. But what the Gnostics were trying to do was precisely to escape the challenge of saying Jesus is the Lord of this world, and in giving allegiance to him, we are forming a counter community to the dehumanizing communities that are in Caesar's world. The Gnostics weren't doing that. They were saying, oh no, we'll let you guys go and suffer in the arena and be torn to pieces by lions or whatever, but we're just going to pursue our own spiritual quest. And Caesar says, that's fine, you get on with that. The Gnostic has no ability to critique Caesar. The Gnostic can sneer at Caesar. And that's what we've seen in so much post-modernity. People seeking their own identity, their own micro-identity, and sneering at the powers that be. But the powers that be take no notice. You know, we had all those years of Lacan and Derrida and Foucault and so on, and we still elected Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Margaret Thatcher in this country and so on. In other words, the self-serving philosophies and spiritualities of Gnosticism and its cognates don't actually cut any ice when it comes to saying no to the powers that be. Now, when the church tries to say no to the powers that be, and you cited Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we could also mention Karl Barth in that same breath, then big trouble. You know, Barth lost his job, had to go back to Switzerland. Dietrich Bonhoeffer lost his life. And many, many others have gone that route. But the Gnostic is above all that. And so the world can go on its merry way and not be challenged by that sort of spirituality. But in John's gospel, there's no question. Look at the controversies Jesus gets into. Look at the number of times they pick up stones to throw at him. Why? Not because he's telling them about some secret spirituality within, but because he's talking about God and God's kingdom and how that's going to change everything.
Well, I think you make a good point that's really instructive to us, which is, the early church wasn't persecuted for their inner life, for what was going on in their heads. They were persecuted for what they were embodying. And even, I feel like even today, if we're getting by without any friction, it may be that we're not embodying much.
I have often puzzled about that, and the older I get, the more not exactly anxious I am about it, because we are where we are and we have to be faithful where we are. But I used to be very puzzled about this in terms of Paul talking about suffering and Paul warning the people in Philippi and Thessalonica that if you follow Jesus, it's going to be tough. People are going to be out after your blood. And then looking around the Western church and thinking, well, nobody much is after our blood. They may not like us. They may laugh at us. They may not come to church, whatever. But they just say, oh, well, you get on, do your own thing. And the answer, but then, of course, if somebody in the church does turn around and say, something here our politicians are getting badly wrong, then immediately, oh, you can't say that. You're the church. You go and teach people how to pray and how to get to heaven. Don't tell us how to run the world. The answer is actually, we believe in the God who runs the world. And through Jesus, he is addressing the world with news of the genuine kingdom, for which your petty little kingdoms are just parodies. And the church has to be able not just to say that, but to be that. And until the church actually is modeling this kind of countercultural community, not surprising if the powers of the world don't actually take any notice of us.
You use the book of John to kind of track these broken signposts. What is it about the book of John that, or when did you notice that this book actually addresses nicely?
Yes, I can't quite now remember where that seed of an idea came from, but when I was working on the Gifford lectures, to mention them yet again, I'll hold up a copy of the book in a minute. I used the image of the broken signposts because in chapter 7 of History and Eschatology, it was a very helpful way of getting from the first 6 chapters to where we needed to get. And chapter 7, the broken signpost chapter, is really all about the cross and about the fact that the place where all the signposts lead is to the broken signpost of the battered, bleeding body of Jesus of Nazareth, and with the words King of the Jews above his head. In other words, he really is the King of the Jews and the Lord of the world. But it isn't that the signposts were reaching up to some distant heaven. It's that God has come down to the place where justice is denied, where truth is trampled on, where freedom is squashed, where spirituality has all gone dark, etc., etc. In other words, the signposts may be broken, but when we tell the story of Jesus and his death, then, oh my goodness, they seem to be pointing to that. And then we can tell the Jesus story in such a way that it makes sense of the whole world, our world, and what God is then going to do about it. So I've been thinking that for some while, for a year or so, and been working on it. And then I thought, actually, I need to spell this out a bit more, but I need to take one biblical book and track with that, because otherwise it's dotting around all over the place. And then I was thinking, well, John's gospel has so much about justice, but people normally ignore that. John's gospel has a lot about truth and power. People normally ignore that, and so on and so on. Many people would say, well, John is a book about love and spirituality. Fine, but that's only 2 out of the 7 signposts. All the rest are there as well. So I then got this glint in my eye, and I thought, wow, it's a thought experiment to take each of these 7, justice, love, spirituality, beauty, freedom, truth, and power, and to read John's gospel asking those questions each time. And then, in order to help the reader, dropping in little bits about how to read John, just short little interludes between those chapters. And so I ran it, I tried it out, I wrote it out, and my publisher said, hey, this is fun. We've never seen anyone doing quite this before. Let's run it. And so that's how it happened. And it was a sort of thought experiment, but I still hope it works.
And the signposts themselves, how did you narrow those down to those seven that you thought these?
Good question. Good question. I started off with 4 in my book, Simply Christian. There I called it Justice, Spirituality, Relationships, and Beauty. And I knew there were other things, but Simply Christian was quite a short book, and I didn't want to over-egg that particular pudding. And I there called them Echoes of a Voice, by which I mean, if you're in a street and you hear somebody calling your name and you can't see where they are, you're looking around. I think I heard something. Is that significant? Who was it? What's going on? And when we hear about or think about justice and spirituality and so on, it's rather like that. And then the point of Simply Christian was to say, put that on hold for a minute. Now tell the Christian story and see how that explains what the voice was and what it was all about. And now see how we can plug back into that. So then over the 15 years since writing Simply Christian, I was thinking, actually, I should have done Freedom and Truth and Power as well, because they all work the same way. If I was moving on again, I might add a few more. I recently reread C.S. Lewis's book, Surprised by Joy. And I think for Lewis, what he meant by joy was somewhere in between what I mean by love and what I mean by beauty. And so I can see triangulations going on. So one could develop other strands as well. But my point about those 7 is, they run across cultures. If you read the literature of ancient Greece, if you read the literature of modern China, if you read anything in between, if you go to a village in Africa, wherever you go, historically, culturally, these are the things that matter to people, whatever their religion or philosophy. Justice and spirituality, relationships, beauty, freedom and truth and power. You can't get very far in human life without bumping up against these issues, both as desirable and as deeply problematic. And then it's a kind of inverse natural theology, which is where that train of thought started, that as we experience the fact that humans run into these things and get bothered by them, then when we tell the Christian story, we say, now we understand why those things matter, why we get bothered about them, and particularly, and John's Gospel is so good at this, how we, in the power of the Spirit of Jesus, can be people of justice, people of wise relationships, people of beauty and freedom and truth and power in the right sense for the sake of God's world. And that seems to be a very powerful argument, but I prefer to think of it as a way of reading a crucial book of Scripture, out of which God can and will do all sorts of new things in the lives of people who set themselves the task of reading it like that.
To go back to power, and I sorry, my questions aren't very linear right now, but
that's okay. My answers probably aren't very linear. It's nearly 10 o'clock at night where I am, and it's been a long day. So go ahead. That's fine.
In the last several years, there have been scandals that have broken with Christian leaders, how they have exploited their power. Even, just this week, news came out about the evangelical leader, Rabbi Zacharias, who passed away recently, but indiscretions, horrible things that appear to be true. And often people will look at that and just kind of attribute it to a moral failing on their part, which of course it was, but it also seems to be something about the shape of the power that they were in, where most of them weren't in places where they could, that there was someone that they could go to that did not see them on a pedestal, that they could be honest and vulnerable with. And it seems like the cross-shaped power would have something to speak to that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I didn't know Ravi Zacharias. I knew people who worked with him, but I'd never met him. And I haven't actually heard any of the things that have been said, so I can't possibly comment on that and shouldn't. But obviously it has been a sad story within Western Christianity and within other generations and Christian cultures as well. And I suspect that most churches, sooner or later, have to face the fact that some of their great leaders have feet of clay. And Martin Luther King who is almost sainted now in various ways. His life was quite a long way from being a model of Christian sanctity all down the line. And that's a real problem. And I feel that, and I think many people feel that. If you can track that to particular cultural things, I'm not sure you can, but I would say the antidote to it is, as you rightly suggested, to have a network of people who will hold you to account. In many cases, that may be one's spouse, if one's spouse is able to do that. Certainly in my case, that would be a strong holding to account. But also a spiritual director who will look you in the eye and say, don't fool yourself here. Do you realize what's going on? Or 2 or 3 wise friends who will check in with you every 3 or 4 months and say, let's go and have coffee and talk about how things really are when it all comes down to it. And then people quickly realize whether they are actually deceiving themselves or not, and drifting into bad paths. And of course, the enemy, the dark force, whatever you call it, the diabolical powers that still lurk around. As Peter says in 1 Peter, your adversary, the devil, like a roaring lion, wanders around looking for somebody to gobble up. So you have to resist him. And Christian leaders are absolutely in that dangerous position, which is not surprising that the devil wants to do that, because if you can make one Christian leader come crashing down, then a whole generation of people who trusted that person, some of them will lose their faith, some of them will just sneer and walk away, and it'll get into the newspapers, and people, oh, you Christians, you're all the same, you're just hypocrites, etc., etc. And you look back at the New Testament church and you just grieve and think this ought not to be how it is. And I thank God that I have known and been mentored by wise, godly people who right through their lives had no sniff of scandal about them, and who I can look up to and think, okay, how do I measure my life in relation to them? And I hope and pray that others will look at my life like that. So yeah, this is a problem. Maybe it's a problem in the Western church because we have tended to idolize our leaders, but I think that's always been a standing temptation in any form of Christian organization. It's not particular to Anglicans or Roman Catholics or Baptists. It runs right across all of us. And I think every generation has to grapple with it.
Well, Tom, thanks for your time. You're really putting the semi and semi-retired, stepping on a Zoom call almost 10 o'clock your time on a Friday night. Thank you. Thank your family for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we really appreciate it.
I suspect my wife is already heading for bed. I warned her this was going to be a late one, but then the reason I couldn't do it earlier in the day was because of something that she and I were doing together. So there was a kind of a quid pro quo. But you're very welcome. And thank you for your publicizing the book. It was an exciting book to work on. And I'm going to be intrigued to see what kind of feedback I get as it goes out and makes its way in the world. So Absolutely. Thank you very much.
I'll be singing its praises. No worries.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Have a great night.
And you.